Hannah here from Nicole Hannah Jewelry and YouTube's Go Art Yourself. Today I'm going to show you how to make this seed bead embroidered barefoot sandal. First I'm going to discuss all the materials that you're going to need, and I'll be sure to list them, what I've actually used here in this project. I'll be sure to list them in the description below. First I started with a freeform Imperial Jasper cabochon. You don't need a cabochon, you can use beads, but you'll need 3 in descending sizes. So then I have a oval black onyx, a smaller round Swarovski crystal, and then a handful of 3mm hematite beads. Now you're going to need a backing on which to sew these beads in cabochons. So I use a piece of black stiff felt. You can buy it for I think 99 cents, and it comes in an 8x10 sheet, and you can get it at your local craft store. You'll also need a piece of suede or a soft fabric as a backing. You're also going to need some E6000 glue, a pair of small scissors. I like to use they're basically bathroom scissors, and I like to use these small scissors because when you're cutting around your bead embroidery, it helps get into all the little nooks and crannies. The thread that I like to use is Wildfire, and it's in the black color, and it's 0.006 inches. You're also going to need some elastic. I'm using black because it corresponds with the rest of the project, but you can use whatever color you can find. This is a 1/4 inch. I would not recommend going any larger than that for this project, but you can go smaller. You're also going to need size 15 round seed beads in any color of your choice. You'll need size 11 delicas in any color of your choice. You'll need some size 11 round beads. These I think are Toho. I like the quality of those. This particular color is a galvanized teal. And then the delicas, are also a teal color. You're going to need some 6mm bugles. I like to match the color of the bugles with the size 15 beads. And you're going to need some beading needles. I prefer size 12, 10. You can use a number of different sizes depending on the size of the holes in your beads. I would suggest just finding a size that works for you and using it. But this project should be able to accommodate either of those sizes. And I like to have multiple needles on hand because they do get bent out of shape. You're also going to need a pair of flat nose pliers. You can use needle nose pliers or chain nose pliers, it doesn't really matter. Another thing that I strongly recommend is this bead mat. It will be a tremendous help to keep beads from flailing all over the place, which I have a tendency to have happen to me. So first you're going to start with your piece of black felt. I recommend planning out ahead of time how you're going to position your stones. I like using this sort of descending pattern because it's going to go on top of the foot, so you want it to start big at the top and then go down to a point the closer to the toes that you get. So I'm putting the E6000 glue on the back of my cabochon, and I'm going to position it on my felt. You want to be sure when you're cutting your felt that you're going to leave enough space on either side to accommodate any beads that you're going to add. So it's always better to cut more than you think you're going to need than to find out that you're going to run short. So I've glued the cabochon on, and then I'm just kind of eyeballing where I think I'm going to want to put the other stones when I'm ready to bead those in place. So I've cut about 3-4 feet of the beading thread. And you'll notice that these beading needles have really, really small holes, and it's really hard to thread or to run the thread through the eye of the needle. So this is where the pliers come in handy. If you pinch the end of the thread, it creates this sort of really flat paddle, and that paddle is much easier to run through the eye of the needle. And then when you get that paddle run through the eye, then you can grip it with the pliers and pull the thread through. I sometimes use really long pieces of thread, and one of the problems with doing that is that the thread can kink and knot while you're working. So it really is better to use 3 or 4 foot lengths versus 5 or 6 feet, which is what I usually use. But if you're just starting out, start with the smaller lengths. Thread can always be added. So on the end of the thread, you're going to create a big knot. So I like to knot in the same place over and over, maybe 3 or 4 times to get a nice big knot. You just don't want the thread to pull all the way out when you run it through when you run your needle through the felt. So this just kind of catches in the back of the felt and holds it in place. So now we're going to start beading. We're going to do a beaded bezel around the cabochon. And you can start in any location. I'm just picking a random spot where I'm going to start. And you want to run your needle from the back up through the felt. And you want to get it fairly close to the stone that you're beading around. So then you pull it all the way through until that knot catches on the back. And then you're going to pick up 2 size 11 delicas. Run that all the way down so that it's sitting nice on the felt. Pull that thread taut and kind of hold it in place. Run your needle from the front to the back through the felt, right at the end of those 2 beads. Make sure they're nice and snug on top of that felt. And then pull your needle through, pull the thread taut. Then run your needle back up from the back at the beginning of those 2 beads. Pull your thread through. Now run your needle through both of those beads. And you'll always be working in 2s. You'll be picking and sewing 2 beads on at a time. To do a beaded bezel, you have to have an even number of beads in this first row. So just by picking up 2 at a time, you always know you're going to have 2 beads and you don't have to worry about keeping count. Add 2 more beads, lay them flush up against the first 2. Run your needle from front to back through the felt at the end of those 2 new beads, and pull your thread nice and taut. Now when you run your needle up to the front this time, go in between the first and second beads. See how going past the last 3 beads. And this way, when you're securing these second set of beads, you're catching the first set as well, and it's just a little extra security. So I'm passing through those last 3 beads. And that's really how you'll continue all the way around. You'll pick up 2, sew 2, then you're going to pass through the last 3. This is just a nice secure method that makes sure all your beads stay put. And you're going to work your way all the way around the stone in this first round in this manner. And I know sometimes I pull it off camera. Beading is such an eye-intensive pastime that I have a tendency to pull it off camera so that I can pull it real close to see what I'm doing. But I usually stop and make sure you can see what I did before I progress. So hopefully that won't get too annoying for you. So here I am passing through the last 3 beads. And then you're going to continue all the way around. And sometimes when you're at the last couple beads, there may be a gap. You may not be able to fit 2 beads exactly, but there's not enough room for 4. So you're just going to have to judge. Sometimes your beads may bunch, the last 2 may bunch together a little bit. I find that preferable to there being a big gap. So, just try to use your best judgment. So there I secured the last 2, and I'm going to pass through the last 3 of this round. But then I'm also going to try to pass through the first 2 or 3 that I laid down at the beginning. So I'm really going through 5 total beads. And this gets me set up nice for the second round. So for the second round, and you'll also notice that I'm going to start holding my thread underneath my thumb. I just picked up 1 delica this time. So now I'm holding my thread underneath my thumb, and this makes sure that it doesn't get in the way when I'm sewing and I don't create a knot accidentally in my thread. So I'm going to skip the bead right next to where the thread is, and then I'm going to go through the following bead. I'm going to just kind of position it so that the bead stacks on top of the one below it. Pick up another bead, another size 11 delica, and then you're going to skip the delica next to the thread, and you're going to go through the bead after that. Just a lot of repetitive steps. Not difficult, but it's time consuming and repetitive. So you pick up, you skip, and you pass. Pick up a bead, you skip a bead, you pass through a bead. And I like to just continuously keep them stacked. It just makes it easier when you're ready to go through round 3. Sometimes they'll stack naturally on their own, but this is an odd-shaped stone that I'm using, and it's not being very cooperative. So I picked up a bead. I'm going to skip this one and go through the next one. And you are going to continue that way all the way around. So now I'm getting to the last bead on the second round. I'm just trying to adjust to make sure that all those beads in the second round stay stacked so that they're nice and available for the third round. So now I'm picking up a bead, and I'm going to go through the very last. I'm going to skip the bead next to the thread, go through the next bead on the first round, which can be a little hard to see when you start stacking up all these beads, but hopefully you can see it. And it can be tricky. Take your time. You're going to bend your needles out of shape doing this because you really got to finagle them and wiggle them to get to those lower rows. So there I've got it in the last bead of the bottom row, the first row. And then I'm also going to pass through the first bead of the second row. And this is called stepping up. So when you step up, it prepares you for the next row. So now that we passed through the first bead of the second row, we're going to be all ready to start adding beads for the third row. And really every row after this is done in the same exact way. You step up. So you're picking up one size 11 seed bead, one delica, and you're just going to pass through the very next bead in the second row. And that's how you're going to continue the next 2 rows with the size 11s. Just pick up a bead, go through the next one. Pick up a bead, go through the next one. So you repeat this process and do 2 more rows. It'll be 4 rows total for the size 11 delicas. You can see I'm about to add the last delica on the 4th row. I'm going to go through the first bead of the 3rd row, then step up. There you go. See how sometimes you can catch both beads at the same time, which is always good. And how many rows you do really depends on the size and shape of your stone. My stone is pretty shallow, so I find that I don't need more than 4. You just want to see those 11s, those size 11s, just barely curving over the top of your stone. Now we're going to start adding the size 15 round beads. Now by adding the smaller sized beads, it helps pull in those size 11. So it creates a nice tight bezel around that stone. That stone's very secure and it's not going to go anywhere. And you'll complete these 2 rows. I like to do 2 rows of the next color of the size 15s. I just find that it really fills it out with the color. So I'm going to do 2 more rows. And you'll see I'm halfway through the 2nd row, and I wanted to show you something. My stone has some corners. They're not very sharp, but they can cause a problem. When you're adding beads, sometimes in corners like this, the bead could bulge out a little, and I don't really like that. So one way to avoid that is where you see the 2 beads kind of bunching together, you just pass through the next bead without adding a bead in the current row. And that'll pull that corner nice and tight together. And then once you get past that corner, you can just continue on adding your beads as usual. So I'm adding my last size 15, and the 2 rows of size 15s are done. And then what we need to do is get that thread back down to the felt so that we can do some bead accents. And to get that thread back down, I just pass it through the beads in the bezel and work my way back down. I know it's off camera a little bit, but here you can see I just passed through one of the beads in the previous row. And you want to be sure that the bead you're passing it through corresponds with the direction that your thread is facing, because you don't want to accidentally cross over the top of a bead and have your thread show. So I'm just doing a kind of seesaw effect, working my way down. And that really helps secure it and finish off the thread nice, so you don't ever have to worry about threads unraveling. And if you run out of thread in the middle of a bezel, you'll do this exact same thing too. You'll work your way down to the bottom, tie off the thread that you're finishing up, tie a knot in the new thread, and then work your way back up to the row that you had to stop on. So I've worked my way down. I'm going to run through the felt from the front to the back. And I like to just do a couple final securing stitches. So I like to pass my needle, just catch a little bit of that felt with my needle. And then when I'm pulling the thread through, I don't pull it through all the way. I would see how there's a little loop. I like to keep that little loop and then pass my needle through the loop. And that really creates a nice secure stitch. And I usually do 3 or 4 of these every time I'm finishing up a section. And this just, God forbid you snip a thread accidentally and you have to undo some of your beading. This assures that you don't have to start from scratch. And you see how bent up your needles can get. Sometimes what I do is I use my pliers to kind of just straighten them out. This won't work indefinitely. The needle will get weak and it'll break eventually. But this gets me a little more use out of it than I would otherwise have. But I still usually can only use 1 needle for a project, and sometimes multiple needles for the same project. I rarely am able to use the same needle for multiple projects. So now I've finished off that other thread. I was running out of thread. I've got a new thread on my needle. And I think I'm going to do a beaded accent around the bezel with the 3mm hematites. And you don't have to do this. The great thing about beading is you can bead whatever you want on the surface. As long as it has a hole that you can pass a thread through, you're good to go and you can secure it. So I'm starting just like I did with the bezel, with the knot at the end of my thread, and I'm pulling it through. I'm going to pick up, just like I did with the bezel, 2 of the 3mm beads at a time. And you can also use different seed beads. I'm using these hematite gemstones, but you can use other seed beads. There's size 8 seed beads that work really well for accents. So I'm laying it flat, just like with the delicas. So this is all the same exact process. Any embroidery that you're going to do, no matter the size, if you're going to do a whole row or very many in a small section, then I always suggest just securing 2 at a time. It just keeps it much more manageable. Yes, it's a little more time consuming, but in the end, you'll have a much more durable piece. And because this is a barefoot sandal and it's going to be worn on a very active part of the body, I generally will recommend doing this kind of stitching. Some people will add 3 or 4 or 5 beads even at a time, but I don't find that very secure, so I tend to do it this way. And you're going to work your way all the way around. So I've added the 3mm beads all the way around my jasper cabochon. And I've still got my thread attached. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start adding some of the 6mm bugles for accents. I'm just starting in a random place. You can start in the middle, and that helps you gauge how many on each side you need to add, but really you can wing it and add it however you want. The only thing that's really important about the beads and the stones and things that you choose for this particular project is making sure that the stones, the 3 main stones, are in descending size so that you have a larger section and it goes down to a point. And I just find that most aesthetically pleasing when worn as a barefoot sandal. So I'm laying my bugle flat. I'm going to secure it just like with the 3mm beads, run from the front to the back. And then I'll bring my needle back up to the bottom of that bugle and then run my thread through the bugle again a second time. That just secures it on there real nice, keeps it from wiggling around too much. The bugles can be a little unwieldy. So now I'm picking up a second bugle. You see my thread is exiting the first bugle. And then I'm going to lay it side by side, just like that. I'm going to turn it around, lay it side by side, and then secure that bugle, run my thread through the felt to the back. And then when I run my thread through the felt again, up to the front, it's going to be at the opposite end of the bugle. Sometimes it takes a little bit to position your needle in the right spot. You just gotta fuss around with it for a little. Get it just in the right spot. Make sure your beads don't sit weird or crooked. So then I'm passing through that second bugle a second time, and you'll continue adding the bugles in that manner, working from side to side. And if you have to cross all the way across the back of your piece to get your thread where you need it, that's fine, because you're not going to see any of the thread on the back. So if you want to make a mess with the thread on the back, that's totally fine, just as long as you don't see the mess on the front. So now I'm just trying to eyeball, and I know this stone is black and up against the black felt, it's hard to tell, but when I position this black onyx stone, I want to be sure that there's enough room between the black onyx stone and the red bugles to allow for me to bead around that black stone. So there needs to be enough room here for the size 11 delicas. Now this black onyx is a bead, so I can secure it without gluing it, but by all means you can use another flat back stone of any kind and just glue it down. So I'm just going to make sure that I have everything positioned where I want. I'm going to secure it, and I'm going to bezel it in exactly the same way that we did the first one. And I liked the hematite accents, so I think I'm going to add the hematite accents around this oval, this black onyx. So you'll see I've added the hematite accents. And then just to fill some space on the sides so that I can get a nicer triangular shape as I work my way down, I've kind of filled in with some smaller beads. You see I've got some 2 square-ish faceted black onyx. I've got 2 smaller 2 or 3 millimeter yellow mookaite stones. And I even filled in some little spaces where you could see the felt. I even filled that in with the size 11 teal round beads. So now I'm adding my final large-ish bead, and this is the Swarovski crystal. I believe this one is a 10 or 12 millimeter. And the color is light cyan for that crystal. So then when I add the crystals, I like to, or any bead for that, any of these big beads like that, I like to pass through the beads several times. At least 3, but if I can manage it, even more than that. I really want them nice and secure. So here you'll see I surrounded the round crystal with the 3 millimeter hematites, and then surrounded the hematites with the size 11 round galvanized teal beads. And then I even added another little small 3 millimeter hematite, and then beaded around that to create this nice pyramid shape. And see, even though we're making a barefoot sandal, you can use this even as a, what do they call it now, a hand flower bracelet, where it goes over the middle finger and then wraps around the wrist. So it's got a couple different ways you can wear it. Now we're going to cut away all this excess felt. And using those itty bitty scissors, you can see I'm really just mostly using the very tips, so because there's so many nooks and crannies of this and so many corners that I want to be sure I'm getting a good cut. And when you're cutting, you want to be able to see a little bit of that black felt from the front. See how you can see a little bit of it? If you can't see it, you've cut way too close, and it's going to make adding an edge really hard. And you also don't want to risk cutting your thread that you've sewn, that you've done all the embroidery with. So now I've cut the shape all the way out, and I'm going to add the elastic for the toe. And really, I think this is like 2.5, 3 inches, probably 3 inches of elastic for the toe. But I suggest, and it will depend how much elastic you need, will really depend on the ultimate length of your beading itself. So just kind of hold it up to your foot, and then, with the elastic, just try to measure it, eyeball it. The elastic will allow for a lot of leeway. So then you want to, create this loop and put the ends of the elastic on top of each other, and then just secure them. I stitched around that bottom beading and caught the elastic, and I stitched probably 10, 11, 12 times to make sure that it was really secure. And then you want to cut enough elastic to go around the ankle. And again, you can just hold it, put that toe piece over your toe, hold it against the top of your foot, and then just kind of gauge to measure that way. And it will, again, depend on the exact stones you use, the measurements of the stones, and how long your beaded piece is. So then I'm going to attach each end of the elastic to either side of the wide side of the beaded project. And I'll secure that and just bring my thread straight up there. No, it's going to all be hidden on the back anyway, so just run your needle right up to the very top corner there and secure it in the same exact way that you secured the toe piece. Make sure you got both of those ends nice and secured. Tug on them a little, make sure they're not going anywhere. And then we're going to add our suede backing. This is an ultra suede. They come in a number of colors. They are a little more expensive, so you can even just go to the fabric store and get any kind of faux suede fabric. But you need it a little bit on the thick side because you don't want it to bunch while you're sewing it. So you add glue to the back of the felt, glue it right to the suede, and then cut along to cut the suede out to the shape of the beading. Just be sure you don't cut your thread accidentally if you do have thread still attached, like I do. After securing the elastic, my thread is still attached. So be sure that you don't cut that thread off, and be sure you don't cut the elastic. So now we're going to start working on an edge for this project. And it just, that way you just have a nice, clean, finished look. So with the delicas again, the size 11 delicas, I'm going to pick up 2. You only need 2 for this first step. After that, you'll be using 1 at a time. So I'm going to go through the back of the piece, run it through the suede and the felt. And you want to leave enough space between where your needle is and where the thread is to accommodate the 2 beads that you just picked up. Doesn't have to be perfect. And then run your needle just through the last bead, not both of them, just through the last bead from the bottom to the top. And this will kind of sit when you pull the thread taut, it'll kind of sit that second bead nice and straight against the edge. The first bead will remain a little wonky, as you can see, but that'll straighten itself out once we add the last bead and close the trim, close the edge. So now we're going to add another bead, pick up 1 more delica, pass through the back of the suede and the felt to the front, and then pass through the bottom of that delica. And that's it. That's all that the edging consists of. A lot of repetition. You'll be doing this all the way around the piece. And you have to change it up a little when you get to where the elastic is coming out, and I'll show you how to do that. Because with the elastic being in the way, you can't work from front to back like this. So then you're just going to work all the way down. Now I've gotten to the elastic down for the toe. And I'm going to pick up, you see my threads coming out of the top of the last bead. And I'm going to, you try to get as close to the elastic as you possibly can. And then pick up 1 more delica. And this time you're going to go through the front to the back. And you're going to be sure to pass through the felt, through the elastic, and through the suede on the back. And that's a lot of layers for these little needles to pass through. So just take your time, reposition. You want to be sure that you're getting a good, you're getting your needle in the right spot in the back. Try to keep your stitches as even as possible. Then you pass it through. And then what you're going to do is you're going to pass your needle just above where that thread comes out. You're going to pass it back to the front. Through all those layers again. And then you're going to go up through the bottom of that bead. And that's what you do until you cross over the elastic. So now I've worked all the way, most of the way around, and you'll see I'm running out of thread. So one of the things that you can do when you run out of thread on the edge is just pass the thread, the needle, up and down through the last 5, 6, 7 beads in the trim. Usually I like to do at least 5. So I'm going to keep working my way down. And then usually what I like to do is try to pass that thread through some of the beads on the surface of the project. So here I'm going to pass through the bugles a few times. And this is just a really secure way to make sure that your thread doesn't unravel. Especially with a heavy wear piece, something that's going to go on the feet or on the hand. So I'm passing back and forth through these bugles as many times as the beads will allow me to pass through them. And then I'm even going to try to run it through the felt a little bit, just catch a little bit of that felt to make one final securing stitch. Just make sure you don't catch the ultra suede on the back because you don't want your thread to show in the middle of the piece. And then catch that little loop, pull tight, and then you can trim off your thread. And when you're going to start a new thread, you're going to do it the same way. You're going to, except backwards. You're going to run through the felt a little bit. You're going to run through several of the beads on the surface. You're going to run through several of the beads on the edge, on the trim. So now I'm adding my final bead to the edge, or I have added it. And now I'm going to run through the top of that wonky, wobbly bead at the start of the edge. And then up through the next bead, then back through the top of the wobbly bead, and then up through the bead on the opposite side. And it's just really moving back and forth between these 3 or 4 beads. Positions that kind of wonky bead and straightens it up nice. And one thing you can do once you get to that bead, and you see I'm also catching some of that suede. You want to be sure you do that so that you don't have a little gap in between the backing and the suede. Or in between the felt and the suede, I should say. So another thing you can do to kind of dress it up is you can add a picot beaded edge. And this is where the size 11 round, the galvanized teal beads, this is where they'll come in handy because they're a little bigger than the delicas. Even though they're the same size 11, it's really just like whole size because these beads are quite larger. So you're going to run down through the top of the very next bead once you pick up 3 of these size 11 round. And when you pull tight, that kind of creates this little pyramid, this point, which is a picot, that's what it's called. So then you're going to skip a bead and go up through the bottom of the next bead. And you're going to pick up 3 more size 11 round. And then you're going to go down through the top of the next bead. And you just continue that all the way around. The shape of this particular project that I'm working on isn't really flattering with the picot edge because all those curves along the side makes the picots sort of point in odd directions. But I did want to show you that you can add that kind of embellished trim all the way around if you like. And then you're going to finish off the thread exactly as you would any other time by running it through several of the beads and running it through some of the felt. Make sure that you secure that final couple stitches. And that's it. You now have a seed bead embroidered